Welcome, friends and colleagues, both new visitors and old friends, to today, May 29th, 2020's installment of Reporting and COVID-19 Conversations with Journalists, a series of conversations sponsored by the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia Journalism School in New York City. I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center, which is a global resource for journalists who cover violence, conflict, and tragedy. This is a whole ongoing series, not only about reporting on COVID-19 as a topic, but on the implications of this pandemic for our reporting and ourselves, talking to a variety of journalists, subject matter experts, folks who can enrich our work and enrich our conversation. I am very lucky today to be here with John Woodrow Cox. John is a winner of the Dart Award for Excellence in Reporting on Trauma. He's a reporter at the Washington Post. He's here today to talk about reporting on children. John has, over several years, devoted a large part of his work at the Post to extraordinarily rich, often embedded, child's eye view reporting of critical social issues. In fact, he has a book coming out next year on children and gun violence, taking off from a series he did, which is what led to his Dart Award a couple of years ago, Children Under Fire, an American Crisis. He now is covering the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on children for the Post, and the first installment in what will be an ongoing series came out a couple of weeks ago, an extraordinary story on the children of healthcare workers. I think we've shared that link with you before you signed up, if you registered. Ariel, my colleague, can also put the link to that in the chat. We'll talk today a little bit about that story, a little bit about reporting on children in general, about the special issues that we need to be paying attention to as reporters right now. For those of you who are new to this set of conversations, the way we typically work is that John and I will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go to questions, which we'll take in the chat, in the Zoom chat, just because that prevents problems with bandwidth, Zoom bombers, and any other road hazards. If you're following on Facebook Live, you'll just need to kind of follow along with the conversation. We should also say that A, this is being recorded and will be posted as part of the ongoing pandemic-related resource library that Dart Center is putting up, and B, my colleague Susan Kaplan, another past Dart Fellow and a veteran public radio reporter, is assembling a running tip sheet on these various chats. So she'll be, as we come up with ideas, questions, she'll be translating those into tip sheet form for us. John, I want to start out by talking a little bit about your piece, which children, in working title, I think that the headline, which I'm now going to have to scroll all the way up to my screen to look at, what happens if you and daddy die? A piece which appeared in the Post just as the pandemic was peaking on April 28th. And in the course of this piece, you introduce us to a number of kids around the country, to Tamina, who is 6, whose parents are both nurse practitioners, who heard from a school friend that everybody who gets coronavirus dies. You introduce us to 10-year-old Case, 6-year-old Zadie, a kid named Gabriel who is sulking and resentful, a few others, and really go under the hood of their experiences with their parents. Let's listen, before we start talking about the story a little bit, let's listen to Zadie, who's 6. Why don't you set this up while my colleague Ariel gets ready to play the clip? Tell us about Zadie and what he's reflecting on here.
Sure. So he's one of four kids of a pediatrician in Washington State. And, Washington State, of course, was hit very hard early on. And they live pretty close to Seattle, where the epicenter was. And so I had a Zoom call with the four siblings, and was just trying to explore their stressors and their fears. And he was really, remarkable, the things that he offered. He didn't talk a lot, but when he did, it was profound. And so what he's talking about here is the idea of trying to, sort of remember his parents, and just his fear of losing them. He had thought a great deal about, and he's 6 years old, but he had thought a great deal about whether his parents would survive. His mom is the pediatrician. His dad ran the office. So they were both, at high risk of exposure.
All right, so let's listen to Zaid. I said Zaidi, which is reflecting my Yiddish background. Let's listen to Zaid.
When you leave for work, then you told me that you have an exposed patient. I'm worried about you now. Okay. That you might get it, and you might give it to us, and then we might get it from there. Yeah, I also worry about my dad, because he's over 50. Because he's a more risk of dying.
As I listened to that, and throughout your story, one of the things I was really struck by was the sophistication of very young children's engagement. They're doing exactly what the rest of us are doing, except perhaps more nakedly, which is projecting forward, wondering what the far side of this pandemic looks like and who we're going to lose. In the constrained circumstances of Zoom interviews and everything else, how did you get to that place of frankness with Zaid? I mean, let's talk about him for a minute.
Well, I've argued for years that journalists don't give kids enough credit. I think that they have so much more to offer than we often suspect. And two, when kids say things that we wouldn't even write down in our notebook, if an adult said it, when a kid says that same thing, it has enormous power, because the reader knows that a child, a 6-year-old, is not framing something or sort of saying something in such a way that it'll appear just right in print. They're just saying it because that's how they feel. So, it was helpful with those four, especially, and I think this is a good tip if you are reporting on kids right now, if they have siblings and you can talk to them as a group. One great thing about that family is I actually got dialogue. It wasn't just an interview where they were, answering my questions. There was conversations going on among all of them. So the first part of that quote is, he's saying that to his mother. And, that just came from an ongoing conversation. I was just really trying to get them to start talking, not necessarily even to me, but to each other. And, it's helpful that in this moment where we can't go, what I would normally do with that story, I would have flown to Washington and I would have spent 3 or 4 days with this family, and I would have watched them sort of in their normal day-to-day life. We can't do that now. I mean, there's some reporting we can do outside, but that level of depth is just not possible. So what's helpful, though, is that kids have all been homeschooled for the past couple of months. They are used to Zoom. Like, they're used to dealing with adults talking to them through a computer screen. So, for none of these kids, either in that story or the stories I have to come, I'm not the first person, the first adult who's having a conversation with them through Zoom. So it's helpful in that way that they have some familiarity already with this form of dialogue.
And with what was sort of the setup with Zaid's parents, did you say, I want a family conversation with all of you, or what was kind of the structure that led into this open conversation? So
any time I report on childhood trauma, I always start with the adults. And I do that in part to understand what the kids' triggers are, if there's things that I shouldn't bring up, because I never want inflict harm, when I talk to a child. And also I seek from the parents a lot of dialogue as well. What are the conversations they've had with their kids? So that when the time comes for me to talk to the kids, I will have all that context, all that background. So I always like to really know the kids before I ever speak to them, whether I'm doing that in person or, virtually. So, I elected in this case, I wasn't sure really how it would go, whether I should do these kids individually or whether we should have a group conversation. But it very quickly became clear that it was really helpful that these kids were all together, because there's another part in the story where the two brothers are sort of debating how many people are going to die. And that was a totally organic moment that could not have been possible if they weren't all sitting together in that room. So although it was sort of chaotic at times because they were all talking over each other and they all wanted to be the center of attention, it really paid off. A lot of these kids, it just worked out this way. Were single, were only children. They were the only kid. They didn't have siblings, so I couldn't do that in every case. But I found it to be helpful. I think if I was going to do a story on just one family, I would want to do some of both, right? Where I would talk to kids individually, where they don't feel the pressure of their siblings to answer in a certain way or to answer the same way, but then also have sort of those group conversations where they can just talk to each other and you can get those great organic bits of dialogue, not just quotes.
One of the other things that strikes me about this story is that it's so rich with anecdotal detail. There's lots of you are there moments. I mean, you begin with one of those when Tamina has not seen her dad for a month, and she hasn't seen her mom in a week, and suddenly she sees her mom outside the window, and you described the whole scene. Tamina Tracy looked over, and when she saw the woman in a blue surgical mask standing outside the Northwest Washington row house, the girl's hazel eyes widened. As reporters, we've been struggling with how do you do rich anecdotal reporting when you're not there. How did you think about that? How did you draw out those kind of details when you couldn't be there for these kids?
Well, so helpfully with that, in that case, I was there. So I was outside because we thought, if I was sort of wearing the proper PPE, I could stand outside. So I had approached the home with the mom.
So that's one where you were present.
Right. I was present, although I didn't know what was going on inside the house. I had to reconstruct that part. I knew that she had run, I could sort of see vaguely through the window that she had run to the door, but very soon after that, I wanted to know what she said. I wanted her voice to be the first voice in the story. I think if we write about kids, their voice should always, the first voice you hear should be a child's voice, not an adult's voice, which almost never happens. But so I wanted that first. And so I called the sister-in-law shortly thereafter and said, okay, what happened in the house when she heard this tapping on the window? Because I only sort of saw her come out, only got those bits outside. So, I was getting a little bit on, live and then reconstructing other pieces of it because I couldn't go in the house, which is, one of the many challenges.
And for the families that were in Seattle, Tucson, wherever else, what did you lean on to get narrative detail there?
Right. So, I've done a lot of reconstruction and before, and I think that you really have to lean on those muscles. And what that means is to get people to tell you minute by minute what happened, right? So in Washington State, for example, I lead with an anecdote where the mother goes into her son's room and he expresses to her that he's afraid that his parents are going to die. And so I had her, and not all the details made that moment, but I always ask people for anecdotes, right? Like take me to scenes. What are the most vivid memories or times when your child has expressed fear or anger or whatever that is, and then tell me what happened. What did you say? Then what did they say? Then what did you say? Then what did they do? What did the room look like? What did it smell like? What was on the wall? Where were you standing? What time of day was it, right? So the the subject becomes a reporter. I mean, that's what they are, right? Is they're the one who's there, and you're mining their memory, and then you take what they've given you, and then you go talk to the other person who is there. In this case, it's children, to get their point of view on that same moment, right? So when I'm talking to people, I like to get the big picture, but then I really want to drill down on those little anecdotes that I can weave into a narrative so that I'm still taking people there, even though I wasn't there. So I spend a lot of time just telling people what happened next. No, go back. What happened right after that? No, go back. What happened right after that, right? Where I'm trying to get every little detail of that moment to reconstruct it as a fully formed scene.
You also did one other very cool thing, which is that you turned to nearly 11-year-old Taylor, young girl, and you got part of her journal, and you made the decision not only to quote it in your story, but actually to put up a whole page from it. That's kind of a letter to her mom from that journal. A, why'd you decide to do that? And B, what was the negotiation around that like? What were the ethics of that?
So, two things I always ask parents right away are, what are the questions that your child has been asking? Because I find there's nothing more revealing about a child's anxiety than the questions that they're asking. If you ask a kid how they're doing, they're normally going to say, I'm okay, I'm fine, right? But if you find out what they've been asking, that's how you can know where their head is. That's one of the questions I ask. The other is, have they written anything? Especially in times of trauma, because they will express detail and feelings in a way that, in the written word, in a way that they often won't when they're talking to you or even talking to their parent. So first I want to know sort of if something exists, if there's a journal entry or a letter or anything like that. And then, I ask permission of the child, however young they are. I ask them, would you mind, or would you be willing to show me something that you've written, and then I let them decide what that is. But it's a conversation with them where it's, could I use this? Could we use a photo of this? And, even somebody as young as 11 or younger, I'm always going to ask permission, and, because that's something personal to them. And so they have to be comfortable with, me using that. So, I always want to give kids power. I really want to empower them. When I do interviews in person, I sit on the floor, because I want their eye level to be above mine. I want them to feel like they're in charge. I'm not an authority figure. They're offering me something. I'm not taking something, right? And so it's what do they feel comfortable sharing? I want them to feel like they're in charge. So, how you do that through Zoom is a little bit more difficult because those sort of like nonverbals are trickier. But, the same idea of sort of asking permission still exists.
I was also struck by how you handled the very sensitive matter of Gabriel, who was experiencing a lot of distress and a lot of anger.
Right.
And the story doesn't gloss over that. And I think that's a little bit unusual because, first of all, so often in reporting, like, we are looking at children and we want children to be sweet and represent the future and all of that sort of stuff. But also, I think because we're worried about parents' sensibilities and portrayals of kids in their worst moments, not just their best, most resilient moments. How did that go? How did you think that through?
Well, I'm a big believer in the old journalism saying of, seeking out the bruise on the apple, because when you portray those moments, it just makes everything more real, because the reader knows those things are happening. They know that kids are angry, that they're lashing out. And if you don't show that, there is a lack of realness to the story. Now, I do think it's really important to be honest with the parent. I take stories about childhood trauma, I take parents very carefully through the story before it publishes. Yeah. Not that I'm giving them any sort of authority to change things, but I just don't want them to be surprised by anything they see in print, because they're offering me so much trust. So, you know, I went through that section, you know, very carefully with Gabriel's mother. She knew what was coming, and she just knew it was real, right? And I think, you know, the way it's framed, it is meant to show you that it's not to be condemnation, right? I'm not trying to sort of condemn him anyway. There's a good reason that he feels that way, but it's a very natural, you know, human emotion. And I think we should not look to avoid those things and to sort of portray people in a positive light, even if they're 6, just because it's not real, right? It just doesn't ring true to the reader, because people know that kids struggle. Everybody struggles, and we need to show that as, you know, carefully and respectfully as we can, right? We never want to inflict harm, but we also want to be real.
We're beginning to get a lot of questions in the chat, so we'll go to that in a minute. But let me ask you a kind of a coronavirus related question, or a subject question. Without giving away any of the good stuff in your reporting yet to come, as you look at this story and the work that you're doing, and you're looking for through lines, what do you think are the crucial issues facing children now that are underreported that could benefit from the global community of journalists paying more attention to them? What were you surprised by in this story? What's surfacing that needs reporter scrutiny right now?
Well, without giving away too much of what I'm personally pursuing, I do think that just in general, we don't write about children and mental health enough. You know, this is a moment of enormous stress. Everybody here has had really dark moments in the last 3 months. Everybody. So if you imagine a kid who maybe has a history of mental health issues, and then suddenly this happens, right? And their world is sort of blown up. Now, you know, a story like that, we would be a lot less likely to name a child. We would, in all likelihood, provide anonymity in a case like that. If a kid was really struggling with mental illness or, you know, mental health crisis, we're not going to likely name that kid. But you know, I think that's an area that is really undercovered, and in part because it's hard to do. That's really hard. That's really hard reporting to do. But you know, you can get at it, I think, different ways. I do think capturing children's anxiety, their fears right now, is really important. That's what, you know, certainly the first story was meant to do. And I was surprised. I guess I always am. I shouldn't be at this point, but I was amazed, I guess, really beyond surprised, as how much the kids did know. I mean, they really knew. They had a level of depth. I mean, the one kid is looking up death rates. You know, he's trying to find out like the likelihood of his mother dying. I mean, that's incredible, you know, but it's not as uncommon as we think it is. You know, it's something that happens. You know, kids have that level of awareness. Almost every time I read a story, I'm extremely impressed with how much these kids know about the world around them.
Yeah. Sophia has a question. We'll go to the chat now. And Sophia has a question that goes to informed consent and crucial ethical issues. How do you explain to children what you're doing? How do you explain to them why you want to write about them and your job as a reporter?
Right. So I've done this for years now. I very carefully explain to them who I am, what I do. I ask them if they know what a newspaper is. Well, you know, normally I start off, I say, do you know what the Washington Post is? A lot of kids do, a lot of them don't. Then I say, do you know what a newspaper is? And usually, more often than not, they do know what a newspaper is. And then I just very carefully explain what I am, what I do. I say, you know, I tell people stories, and I want to tell your story because, you know, your story, whatever it is, it represents a lot of other kids' experiences right now. It's going to make people feel less alone. It will let the world know what kids like you are going through. And I often will show them either a physical copy of a newspaper, or I will show them articles on my phone. I will take out the phone and show them photos of other kids I've written about, and I'll show them paragraphs, you know, in stories that I've written to just convey, you know, very clearly what it is that I do. So I mean, the youngest child I've ever written about was 4. This was a story that I wrote for the series,
Yeah.
the Dart series, and he was a kid who was shot in a drive-by, road rage incident. And even with him, I explained as well as I could
Mhm.
what I do and why I was there.
Mhm.
And, a lot of it is about, permission from them. Do you feel like talking right now? Do you not?
Yeah.
I mean, kids often don't want to talk in that moment, and that's okay. And we should not press them. You should
Yeah.
never press a kid to talk about something that they don't want to talk about. Sometimes it's just their mood in that moment. Come back later, try again.
Yeah.
So yeah, I go to great lengths as much as I possibly can to explain to them what I'm doing, why I'm talking to them, and then what I'm going to do with what they tell me.
Yeah. Brianna says she's working on a story about kids who've gone into foster care during the pandemic. And this, I'm sure there are other folks on this call who are working on stories about kids who are dealing with institutionalization, hospitalization, foster care. And she's having a lot of privacy issues with sources who are hesitant to give her access to kids or to let them alone. And ultimately, she says, they may give us about an hour. How do you try to to reassure people that you'll protect their identity given sensitivity and win the cooperation of authority figures, whether it's parents or institutional gatekeepers for whom there are special, perhaps legal obligations?
Right. I mean, that's hard. I'm working on some similar stories right now about, kids in systems that are reluctant to expose them to a journalist. And, I take people sort of through the steps that we're going to take to protect their identity, to protect the parent's identity. It helps in my case that I've written some stories like this before. So I always send people my work. That's really, I have found over and over, that is the easiest way to get in. Is you can say whatever you want, but if somebody can actually read a story that is similar to what you're trying to do now, it makes it really clear to them. So I wrote a story back in 2015 about a girl who was born with HIV. And I followed her for 6 months through the process of learning that she had HIV. She was totally anonymous. Her adoptive mother was anonymous. We didn't say where she lived. We had photos that only showed her feet. We went to great lengths to protect her identity. And so I use that story now over and over when I'm trying to convey to someone what we can do to protect their identity. So if you have those stories, or even if it's not one of your stories, if it's somebody else's, and you can just say, here's what we've done before, here's what this other reporter has done, this is what I'm going to do in this case. Yeah. So, that's a tough sell, and you're going to get no 19 times out of 20. But, these stories, they just take one yes, that's it. And you just have to keep trying and trying and trying. I mean, I've been, my last story published over a month ago, and I've been working for the last 4 weeks chasing a number of different stories, but I've gotten a lot of no's. I mean, that's just part of it. The stories I did in 17 and 18, I got many, many, many more no's than I got yeses. So you just have to keep working at it until you get that one yes, because that's all you need.
That actually relates to a question that Emma asked in the chat earlier, which is about how to take your approach, which gives us such rich results, but apply it to reporters who are working in less well-resourced newsrooms than the Washington Post, where you may have much more severely constrained time for enterprise stories, certainly aren't going to be able to spend 3 days on Zoom with a family. If your time is more constrained, or if you have only 1 hour with a family, what do you think you can still do in this, especially in this kind of challenging environment of not being able to be there in person? What can you still do to build that trust, to move the story forward? How would you handle it when you've got less time, less resources?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. And certainly, before I came to the Post, I was in that situation where I was writing, dailies all the time. And, a big part of enterprise, especially early in a career, is sacrificing lots of your own time to work on stories that you care about. I mean, I spent countless nights, weekends when I was a cops reporter in Florida, pursuing stories that I really cared about and that I was trying to get onto the front page. You know, sometimes we have less time because of deadline, you know, because we just, especially in this moment, the tolerance for, you know, oh, go spend weeks on something. You know, everybody wants pandemic stories now, even big enterprise, they want it now. So, you know, one way, if you have limited time with someone, like you really need to be prepared to get, before you walk into that hour. I mean, you can't have any wasted time. That means you've done all your pre-reporting. I pre-report, no matter how much time I have, I pre-report like crazy. You know, I want to know, I have people take me through their chronology always. It's where, you know, where were you born? You know, even if that's the parent, right? Even though if those are sort of tangential characters, and I can do that over the phone. I don't need to be there to do that. I try to not do, you know, especially with adults, I try to not do any interviewing if I can avoid it in person. Now, if it's really sensitive and you can't do it over the phone, that's something else, right? Like maybe you need to be there, they need to look you in the eye and you need to have that conversation. But as much sort of people on the periphery, like I try to do all that reporting ahead of time over the phone, have all those notes ready so that I know exactly what I need when I walk into that sort of key moment or interview. And so, yeah, I just know exactly what I need, what I want out of that moment. Certainly, if I was with a kid too, I mean, you know, you always are sort of weighing, is this a story that is reconstruction? Is this a story where I'm looking for scenes and moments? Like that's a constant debate. I mean, I went to Townville. This is where there was a school shooting. This was part of the 2017 series. I went up there 8 months after the shooting, not knowing, is this story going to be all live reporting or is it all going to be reconstructed? And when I got there, it became very clear that, okay, this is a story that basically needs to be entirely reconstructed because there was nothing happening in the moment. So those conversations with those kids were interviews. I wasn't watching them hang out or do homework or play with their friends. I was having conversations about things that had already happened because there was no tension in the moment, right? So that's one thing you need to be understanding too, right? Am I there to witness a scene, to witness a moment, or am I there to have a conversation, right? And so
what about selling these stories to editors? It is a big investment of time, even if you're going to do it in a more constrained way. And I mean, at this point, your editors at the Post know what you can do, and they probably tend to give you the green light. But I think there's often going to be resistance that local reporters, editors will have to the time, or concern about legalities, or
right.
you know, et cetera. And how have you succeeded in pitching these stories to editors?
You know, I think that you know, it's certainly easier for me now because my job is to do nothing but these sorts of stories. But when I before that, you know, when it wasn't my job, when I was a beat reporter, what I found was that the more really good pieces of enterprise you wrote, the more you got to write them. You know, when you've proven that you can do this, you get more and more and more leash. So that's why those very first stories, you often just have to do under really difficult conditions where you're still writing your daily, you know, every day you're putting out copy and you're just finding time to tell that story and make sure it's good. You know, it needs to be good because it's hard to, you know, carved out time to maybe you negotiate half a day here and there with your editor and then the story is just okay. They're not likely to say yes again, right? Yeah. So that's really as complicated as it was for me. Is I wrote stories that were good enough for them to say yes to the next story, and then one just built on the other. You know, so but certainly selling them on the importance, like why is this story important? You need to be able to convey that in one sentence, like why our news organization needs to tell this story. Very plainly, this is why we're going to miss out. This is the public service that this story will deliver. You know, you need to be confident and aggressive with your editor, selling them on that idea, right? And but you know, in my experience, good editors, when they recognize, okay, this person has a talent for this, they did it quickly or they did it, you know, they did it efficiently. Okay, I'll let you do this again. You know, but if you have big misses 2 or 3 times, they're not going to keep saying yes.
Yeah. I have a narrative question. It's really about writing about children. Writing about children is really hard because, first of all, the storytelling point of view, the child's eye view,
Right.
is a special point of view that is hard to define. And secondly, all of us have a tendency, or many of us have a tendency, probably, to look for the reassuring, the calming, the Hallmark Hall of Fame, the sentimental in our in child reporting. When I'm reading, What Happens If You and Daddy Die, I'm struck both by the constant presence of the child's eye view and by this feeling that all sentimentality has been stripped out of the story.
Right.
How do you handle those two issues? What are and again, I don't want you to give away your special sauce, but from a storyteller's point of view, where do you get that child's eye view, and how do you avoid those pitfalls of the cute, the sentimental, the sort of baby seal pup reporting on children?
Well, I think sentimentality was sort of beaten out of me pretty early in my career. I had some good editors who just didn't tolerate that, about whether it was a child or an adult or anybody. Those stories just never ring true. The quickest way for me to just bail on a story is to get some hint of sentimentality up high, right? Like, okay, I know where this story is going. It's just not real. Like those stories just aren't real. I mean, good stories are about conflict and they're about tension. A story, especially narrative is all about tension, and sentimentality just can't exist in that universe. So, I find that I'm often, your instinct is often to sort of follow the parent, have a conversation with the adult, and that can bleed into your work, right? So my original lead on that story about the children of healthcare workers, I didn't have the little girl's voice first because I didn't know what she had said. So I had written a version of it in which the first voice that you hear is the mom. And that immediately establishes the wrong point of view for the reader, right? Like, even though I'm standing there with the mom, so I can see her point of view, that's not what I'm trying to convey to the reader. I mean, what makes my stories, I think, different than most stories about kids is just the point of view, is that it's through the perspective of the child. And one way you get at that is to start with them, right? It's like, what is going on in their head? What's coming out of their mouth? How are they reacting to the scene? Not how is someone, reacting to them or causing them to react. Like, how do they respond, right? So often it's just, whose head do you start in? Yeah. Because you have it in your notebook. It's just not maybe your instinct to start with the kid. It's well, obviously I'm going to start with the adult, but then it doesn't feel like a story about kids, Yeah.
So keep those questions coming in chat, folks. We have another 5 or 10 minutes. I want to go back to a question that Susan Kaplan asked earlier, which is another kind of core ethics question that the journalists have been struggling about for several years with vulnerable folks, but I think takes on special meaning now, which is that kids are going to grow up and the story lives on the internet forever. You've described them at a really vulnerable moment in their lives. Do you worry, as Sue says, are you concerned that they will have regrets later? And actually, you've now been doing this long enough. Have you gotten kind of blowback from families years later who've said, okay, enough?
I haven't. I mean, I haven't experienced that. I mean, I think early in my career, I made some, as I think as many of us do, I made some, not in terms of errors that that warranted corrections, but some errors in maybe that sort of like protecting someone, right, who is vulnerable, whatever age they are. And it's a constant debate, right? I mean, part of it is detail selection, right? Like, what do you choose to use and what harm? Like, you should think about every detail that goes into a story and what it might look like 15 or 20 years from now. That should be a question that you and your editor discuss. Anytime I'm asked this question, I often reference a story that I wrote for the Tampa Bay Times when I was a crime reporter there. Mike Wilson, who's now at the Dallas Morning News, was the managing editor at the time, and he edited this story. It was a really short daily story. It was maybe 15 inches. A colleague of mine and I, the photographer and I, had heard on the scanner that an infant was pulled out of a pool. We heard this on the scanner. So we rushed to the scene. We actually get there right when the ambulance is pulling away. And the mother was not at home at the time. She was standing outside, pacing, smoking a cigarette, and the dad's inside.
Mhm.
And we very quickly find out from our law enforcement sources that the child has died on the way to the hospital. The parents don't know that yet. So there's this moment when they finally take the mother in. We're outside. They deliver this news, and there's this horrible scream inside the house, and the dad bursts out the front door and collapses in front of us on the lawn. I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. And there were two details that Mike Wilson, in his wisdom, removed from that story. One was, and this is a detail that I still debate, the father, the reason they didn't let the mom in is because the dad was vomiting. He couldn't stop throwing up. And we took that out. And Mike felt like it was a detail that we could afford to lose, and it would protect this guy's dignity. Another detail, and one that was absolutely the right decision, was that the reason the infant got out, the toddler got out of the house, was because an older sibling had left the door to the back porch open. So the kid had gotten out and fallen in the pool. And even though we weren't going to name any of those, or, we weren't going to name the older kid, that was going to exist forever, right? And so Mike was very wise. It was a lesson that I've never forgotten, right? Is that those are incredible details, but they would have done more harm than good, right? So I think some of it doesn't come down to, well, do I write about this person or not? A lot of it comes down to what details do I use? That is still, though, there isn't a clean and clear answer to that. And it's always a debate. I mean, I struggle with it in this book. This book is at times that is coming out next year. It's really dark. I mean, it's really very dark at times. And, I debated a great deal, where to use those details and if to use them.
Let me close by asking you a kind of a broader question about the reporting agenda right now. There are reporters on this in this seminar from all over the world. Some of them local reporters, some of them national reporters. You've now spent quite a few years looking at the impact of difficult events on children. If someone were a local reporter, whether a local reporter in Tucson or in Bangalore or wherever it is, and you're trying to look for the markers of whether your community or your nation are doing well by kids during this pandemic with the particular stresses and issues that are coming up now, what are some places you think reporters should be looking?
I think nonprofits, especially in this moment, are a great place to start. What you're looking for, normally I would say go to community meetings, go to your poorest neighborhoods and start showing up to community meetings, because you're going to hear people talking about, their kids' struggles. Those community meetings aren't happening right now. So you have to find the people who are dealing with the affected population day to day. Right now, those are largely nonprofits. Those are people who are feeding those groups. They're offering financial assistance. They're offering people care who are maybe in abusive homes. So that's, where to start, really. And just think about sort of like, okay, whatever the story is that you're trying to get at, who are the people who are dealing with those kids and those families day to day? Like, who do they interact with? And maybe those are teachers, maybe those are principals at their schools, those are maybe social workers, and those are the gatekeepers. Stories about kids especially, there's always gatekeepers, but any kind of stories about trauma, because somebody's protecting the vulnerable population. So who is that, right? Who's working with that? Who's supporting those people? Those are the people you need to find, because they're going to know where the story is, right? So that's always what I, especially now, right? Like that's really our only way in. We can't go knock on doors. We can't go hang out in places like we normally would. So who is knocking on those doors, or at least having phone calls or emails or Zooms with those people.
That's as good a place as any to wind it up, John. Thank you.
Sure.
We very much look forward to the succeeding pieces in your ongoing series now about children and COVID-19 in the Post. We look forward to your book, Children Under Fire: An American Crisis, coming out next year. Thank all of you on Zoom. I want to thank Ariel Richen from the Dart Center, who has been driving the car on the engineering side of this, Susan Kaplan, who's preparing the tip sheet. Please stay with us. Come back next week. We will be talking to Stephen Southwick, professor of psychiatry at Yale and one of the nation's great experts on the science of resilience. Steve Southwick is a longtime Dart Center friend and ally. This will be a really rich conversation. Thank you all, and see you soon. Go out and commit good acts of journalism.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John.